25th of December, 1776, 11 o'clock at night. The Delaware River near McConkey's Ferry, Pennsylvania. The temperature is well below freezing. The wind is driving sleet and snow horizontally across the water. Massive chunks of ice, some the size of dining tables, crash against the wooden hulls of flat-bottomed Durham boats. 2,400 men are loading into these boats in total darkness. They are starving. Many of them have no shoes. Their uniforms, if you can call them that, are rags. They have not been paid in months. Their enlistments expire in 6 days. In 6 days, the entire army dissolves. There will be no revolution, no United States, no Constitution, no nothing. Their commander stands at the riverbank watching. He is 44 years old, 6'2" in an era when most men are 5'7". He has lost every major battle he has fought in the last 4 months. He has been driven out of New York, driven out of New Jersey, driven across this very river in retreat just 3 weeks ago. His own officers are writing letters to Congress asking for him to be replaced. The British think the war is effectively over. British officers in New York are attending winter balls and dinner parties. They have stopped considering him a serious threat. His name is George Washington, and tonight he is about to do something that makes no sense by every conventional rule of war. He is about to cross an ice-choked river in a blizzard to attack a superior enemy force in their winter quarters, at night, with an army that cannot reliably fire its muskets because the gunpowder is wet. 3 separate crossing points are planned. 2 of the 3 fail immediately. The river is too dangerous. Only Washington's column makes it across, and it takes 9 hours. 9 hours of men fighting the current, ice smashing against the boats, horses panicking in the dark, artillery nearly sinking. They reach the New Jersey shore at 3 in the morning. The plan called for a pre-dawn attack under cover of darkness. That window is gone. It'll be broad daylight by the time they reach Trenton. Washington pushes forward anyway. His men march 9 miles through a driving snowstorm. Bloody footprints mark the frozen road behind them. Men with no shoes, feet sliced open by ice and frozen gravel. 2 soldiers die of exposure on the march itself, collapsing in the snow and never getting up. When they reach the outskirts of Trenton just after 8 in the morning, the Hessian garrison is completely unprepared. They have been celebrating Christmas. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, has been playing cards. A local loyalist tried to hand him a warning note about Washington's approach. Rall shoved the note in his pocket, unread, and went back to his game. 90 minutes later, the battle is over. More than 900 Hessians surrender. Colonel Rall is shot from his horse and mortally wounded in the streets. American combat deaths, 0. 0. This was not luck. This was not desperation. This was the opening move in a war strategy so unconventional, so counterintuitive, that the most powerful military empire on earth never figured out how to counter it until it was far too late. Friends, hello. With you is a channel about history, and today we are going to talk about something that most school textbooks get completely wrong: the American Revolution. When you learn about it in school, it sounds almost inevitable. The brave colonists, the noble cause, the British, overconfident and fumbling, eventually giving up. A story of liberty triumphing over tyranny. That is not what happened. That is a fairy tale. The real story is far more interesting and far more instructive about how power actually works. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress handed George Washington a job that nobody in their right mind would want: Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. This sounded impressive until you understood what the Continental Army actually was. A loose collection of local militias. No unified training, no standard equipment, no reliable source of funding. Washington had some experience from the French and Indian War 20 years earlier, but nothing that prepared him for what he was about to face. The numbers alone were staggering. Britain had the largest navy in the world, over 270 warships patrolling the Atlantic, They had professional soldiers who had been drilling since childhood, trained officers from Europe's finest military academies, and a war chest deep enough to hire 30,000 German mercenaries, mostly from the region of Hesse, on top of their own regular forces. Washington had farmers, shopkeepers, teenagers who had never fired a musket at another human being. His soldiers signed up for short enlistments, sometimes as little as 90 days, and when their time was up, they walked home. Regardless of what was happening on the battlefield, imagine trying to win a war when your entire army evaporates every 3 months and you have to recruit a new one from scratch. And in the beginning, every fear was confirmed. The Battle of Long Island in August of 1776 was a catastrophe. British General William Howe outflanked Washington's forces on multiple fronts and nearly trapped the entire Continental Army against the East River on Brooklyn Heights. Washington had around 10,000 men defending the position. Howe's forces overwhelmed them so thoroughly that the war almost ended that single afternoon. If Howe had pressed his advantage that evening, he probably would have destroyed the rebel army entirely. The revolution would have been over. Washington would have been captured. The Declaration of Independence, signed just 1 month earlier, would have become a historical footnote, a document signed by men who were promptly hanged for treason. But then something happened. A dense fog rolled in over the East River. Overnight, Washington organized a silent evacuation. Using every boat he could find, he ferried 9,000 soldiers, their horses, their artillery, and their supplies across the river to Manhattan. The entire operation took about 9 hours. The British sentries positioned less than 600 yards from the embarkation point never heard a thing. When the fog lifted and Howe realized what had happened, the American army was gone. That retreat saved the revolution. But more importantly, it taught Washington the lesson that would define his entire approach to the war. He could not beat the British in a straight fight, not on an open field, not with formed ranks and bayonet charges, not with these numbers, this training, these supplies. So he stopped trying. And that decision changed everything. Military historians call what Washington did next the Fabian strategy. The name comes from Quintus Fabius Maximus, a Roman general who faced an impossible situation. Hannibal and his Carthaginian army had crossed the Alps and were rampaging through Italy. Hannibal was winning every battle. He was the greatest battlefield commander of the age. Rome was on the verge of collapse. Fabius understood something that the other Roman generals did not. Hannibal was dangerous precisely because his army was so good at pitched battles. So Fabius simply never gave him one. He shadowed Hannibal's forces, he cut off his supply lines, he harassed his foragers. He waited. He understood that time was a weapon. Every day Hannibal spent marching through Italy without a decisive victory, his army weakened. His supplies dwindled, his allies grew restless. Washington applied the same logic to the British. The Continental Army did not need to win battles, it needed to survive. As long as Washington kept his army intact and in the field, the revolution continued. Every day the war dragged on, cost Britain millions of pounds sterling. Every month the British failed to deliver a knockout blow. Political support for the war in Parliament eroded a little more. Washington understood something that the British commanders, with all their military training and aristocratic confidence, completely missed. Time was on his side. The British had to win quickly and decisively. Washington just had to not lose. Here is the key insight. Think about it for a moment. Most military commanders measure success by what they take. Ground captured, cities seized, enemy forces destroyed. Washington measured success by what he kept his army intact, the revolution alive, the idea of independence surviving for one more day. He changed the definition of winning. And once you change the definition of winning, the entire strategic calculus shifts. So instead of charging into glorious battle, Washington retreated. He retreated across New Jersey. He retreated through Pennsylvania. He retreated so many times that his own officers started questioning whether he had any intention of fighting at all. British generals mocked him in their dispatches back to London. Loyalist newspapers in New York called him a coward and predicted the rebellion would collapse within weeks. His own army was hemorrhaging soldiers because men who signed up to fight for freedom did not sign up to spend months walking away from the enemy. But Washington was not running scared. He was watching. And what he saw was the British making exactly the mistake he needed them to make. After taking New York City, the British spread their forces across New Jersey in a chain of isolated outposts. They were so confident the war was winding down that General Howe returned to New York for the winter social season. His officers threw elaborate parties. The Hessian garrison at Trenton felt so secure that their commander, the same Colonel Roll who would die with an unread warning note in his pocket, dismissed concerns about a possible American attack. And Washington saw his opening. The Delaware crossing was a strategic masterstroke, not a desperate gamble. Washington chose Christmas night specifically because he knew the Hessians would be celebrating. He understood enemy psychology. He understood that the best time to strike was when the enemy felt safest. But Trenton was not enough. One victory, however spectacular, does not win a war. Washington knew the British would respond with overwhelming force. And they did. British General Charles Cornwallis marched south with over 5,000 troops to crush Washington's small force, which had reoccupied Trenton after the battle. Cornwallis arrived on the evening of January 2nd, 1777. He found Washington camped behind Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis decided to wait until morning to finish the job. According to multiple accounts, Cornwallis told his officers he would bag the old fox in the morning. Washington kept his campfires burning all night long. He ordered a small detachment to stay behind, feeding the fires, banging shovels into the frozen ground as if digging fortifications, making enough noise to convince Cornwallis that the entire American army was still in position. Meanwhile, the actual army wrapped the wheels of their cannons in rags to muffle the sound and slipped away on back roads in the frozen darkness. By dawn, Cornwallis attacked an empty camp. Washington had already marched 12 miles north and slammed into the British garrison at Princeton, winning another quick victory. Cornwallis had been completely outsmarted by a man he had dismissed as a beaten fox hiding behind a creek. Here is the pattern. It is worth pausing to appreciate. Washington did not win by being stronger. He won by being smarter. He used information as a weapon. He made the enemy see what he wanted them to see. And while they reacted to illusions, he struck where they were weak. But the victories at Trenton and Princeton, however critical for morale, did not change the fundamental math of the war. The British were still stronger, still better equipped, still controlled every major port city along the coast. Washington went back to his Fabian approach, picking fights only when conditions favored him, melting away whenever the British tried to force a major engagement. And then came the winter of 1777 to 1778. Valley Forge. If you want to understand what made the American Revolution possible, you have to understand Valley Forge. Not the cleaned-up version, not the heroic paintings, the reality. Washington's army, roughly 12,000 men, set up camp at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia. What followed was 6 months of suffering that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Soldiers lived in crude log huts they built themselves. 12 men packed into a structure barely 14 feet by 16 feet. Food was so scarce that men survived on fire cakes, flour mixed with water and cooked on hot rocks. That was a meal. Flour and water on a rock. Disease swept through the camp relentlessly. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox. Approximately 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge, not from British bullets, but from starvation and sickness. Clothing was so short that hundreds of men could not leave their huts because they had nothing to wear. Imagine that. You are fighting for the idea of freedom, and you are freezing to death in a hut you built with your own hands, eating flour paste cooked on a rock, while the enemy sits in warm houses in Philadelphia drinking wine by the fire. And yet, something remarkable happened in that frozen camp that the British never saw coming. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived. He could barely speak English and had to give instructions through translators, but he was relentless. He personally demonstrated every maneuver, standing in the mud with the enlisted men, showing them exactly how to hold a bayonet, how to march in tight formation, how to reload and fire in coordinated volleys. The army that limped into Valley Forge was a collection of desperate amateurs. The army that marched out in the spring of 1778 was something the British had never faced before. A professional fighting force with the discipline of European regulars and the motivation of men fighting for their own soil. But Washington had another weapon, one that operated in total secrecy, one that never appeared in any battle plan, one that was, arguably, more important than any musket or cannon: espionage. Washington was obsessed with intelligence gathering. He ran one of the most effective spy networks of the 18th century with almost no budget and a team of civilian amateurs who had no formal training in tradecraft. He understood that information is force multiplication. Knowing where the enemy is, what they plan to do, when they plan to move. This is more valuable than having more soldiers. The most famous operation was the Culper Ring, a network of ordinary people operating deep behind British lines in occupied New York City. They used coded names, numbered substitution ciphers, invisible ink developed by a patriot physician named James J., brother of founding father John J. Secret messages were written between the visible lines of innocent-looking letters. Only a specific chemical reagent could reveal the hidden text underneath. One of the ring's key operatives, codenamed Samuel Culper Jr., was actually a merchant named Robert Townsend, who ran a dry goods shop in Manhattan. He gathered intelligence simply by socializing with British officers who openly discussed military plans over drinks, never suspecting that the quiet shopkeeper was memorizing every detail. His reports traveled through a chain of couriers. A woman named Anna Strong reportedly used her clothesline on the shore of Long Island Sound as a signal system. A black petticoat on the line meant a new message was waiting at one of several dead-drop locations. The number of handkerchiefs indicated which specific location to check. This was the level of sophistication. A clothesline, handkerchiefs, and it worked. But Washington did not just collect intelligence. He weaponized disinformation with a skill that would impress modern military strategists. He had his officers write fake dispatches describing troop movements and reinforcements that did not exist. He arranged for those papers to fall into British hands through captured couriers who were actually double agents. He planted forged letters discussing phantom armies arriving from France. He created entire fake encampments with decoy tents and manufactured supply orders for forces that were completely fictional. The British spent enormous resources chasing threats that existed only on paper. Think about that. Washington was outnumbered, outgunned, outfunded. His army was starving. And yet he was so far ahead of the British in the information war that they were chasing ghosts while he read their actual plans. And now we come to the climax, Yorktown, 1781. The trap that won the war. By the summer of that year, British General Cornwallis had marched his army of roughly 7,500 troops to Yorktown, Virginia, a small tobacco port sitting on a peninsula where the York River meets the Chesapeake Bay. He was fortifying the position, waiting for reinforcements and resupply from the British fleet in New York. Washington saw an opportunity that might never come again. The problem was distance. Cornwallis was roughly 350 miles south of Washington's position outside New York City. If Washington simply marched his armies south in the open, British Commander General Henry Clinton in New York would immediately realize what was happening and either reinforce Cornwallis by sea or attack Washington's weakened northern positions. Washington needed Clinton to believe, with total, absolute conviction, that New York City was the real target. So Washington launched what might be the greatest military deception of the entire 18th century. He ordered the construction of a massive fake camp in northern New Jersey, complete with brick bread ovens large enough to feed an army of thousands. He had his troops build boats along the New Jersey shore, arranged as if preparing for an amphibious crossing to Manhattan. He wrote detailed attack plans for a full assault on New York and made sure British spies intercepted them. He even marched French troops in conspicuous formations toward New York's outer defenses, where British scouts could observe and report them. Clinton swallowed the deception completely. He pulled every available soldier tight around New York and prepared to defend against a major assault. Meanwhile, Washington's real army, combined with roughly 4,000 French regulars under General Rochambeau, was racing south toward Virginia at a speed that seemed impossible for the era. They covered the full distance in just a few weeks, passing through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland before swinging into Virginia. By the time Clinton finally realized New York was never the target, Cornwallis was already surrounded. And there was one more piece of the trap. French Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse had sailed 28 warships from the Caribbean into the Chesapeake Bay, sealing off Yorktown from any hope of British naval rescue. When a British relief fleet of 19 ships under Admiral Thomas Graves finally arrived from New York, de Grasse sailed out and engaged them in the Battle of the Virginia Capes on September 5, 1781. The French battered the British squadron badly enough that Graves retreated to New York for repairs. Cornwallis was now completely sealed on the Yorktown Peninsula. No escape by land, no escape by sea. The trap was closed. The siege lasted about 3 weeks. Washington's combined force of over 17,000 American and French troops set up a semicircle of heavy artillery around the British fortifications and began bombarding them around the clock. French siege engineers, the best in Europe, directed the construction of parallel trenches that crept closer and closer to the British lines. Each new trench brought the guns within more devastating range. Inside the Yorktown defenses, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Cornwallis ordered hundreds of horses slaughtered and thrown into the York River because he could not spare the feed. His soldiers were running low on ammunition and food. Disease was spreading. Desertion became a daily occurrence. On the night of October 14th, the Allied forces launched their most critical assault. 2 columns charged key British defensive positions called redoubts in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The second column was led by a young colonel named Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Alexander Hamilton, who had been begging Washington for a field command for years. Washington ordered the attack carried out with unloaded muskets to maintain silence and speed. Hamilton's men climbed the earthen walls and took the position in under 10 minutes using only bayonets. 2 days later, Cornwallis attempted one final, desperate gamble. He tried to evacuate his remaining forces across the York River at night, hoping to break out and link up with other British units. The first boats made it across successfully. But then, as if the weather itself had chosen a side, a sudden violent storm swept across the river. Wind and rain scattered the remaining boats and drove his half-evacuated army back to the Virginia shore. Whatever slim hope Cornwallis had left disappeared with that storm. On October 17, 1781, a single British drummer boy appeared on the ramparts of the battered Yorktown fortifications and began beating for a parley. The guns fell silent. 2 days later, over 7,000 British soldiers marched out of their ruined positions and laid down their weapons. According to tradition, the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down" during the surrender ceremony. Some historians debate whether that specific detail is accurate, but the symbolism could not be more fitting. When news of Yorktown reached London, British Prime Minister Lord Frederick North reportedly paced the room repeating the words, "It is all over." He was right. Now, here is the thing we have to sit with. The thing that makes this story genuinely profound rather than just an interesting piece of military history. Washington won not because he was a great battlefield commander. He lost more battles than he won. He lost New York. He lost Philadelphia. He lost nearly every major city the British wanted. He was not a brilliant tactician like Napoleon or Alexander. He did not have the resources of Caesar or the ruthlessness of Genghis Khan. But he understood something that none of those commanders had to understand. He understood that in his specific situation, in his specific war, winning battles was the wrong metric. The British could lose 10 battles and still win the war. They had unlimited resources, professional armies, global empire. Washington could lose one decisive battle, and the revolution was over. So he redefined the game. He turned weakness into doctrine, retreat into a weapon, deception into force multiplication, time into an ally. The British came to fight a conventional war, capture the capital, destroy the army, force a surrender. Washington gave them a ghost who would not stand still, who struck when they slept, who fed them lies they believed completely, who vanished every time they tried to corner him. By the time the British finally understood what he was doing, Cornwallis was already handing over his sword at Yorktown. This is not just a story about military history. It is a story about how to think about power. The British had every objective advantage. In any rational cost-benefit analysis, they should have won. But Washington understood that war is not a spreadsheet. It is a contest of endurance, information, psychology, and time. And he was willing to be patient in a way that his enemy was not. The British Empire, the most powerful nation on earth, was defeated by a man who figured out that winning and not losing are not the same thing. And sometimes, in the right situation, not losing is enough. Friends, if this was interesting to you, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. In the next video, we will talk about the other side of this story, the intelligence war that decided the revolution, and the ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, a woman with a clothes line, who ran an espionage network that changed world history. Until next time.